welcome back to Football Break, your weekly review of the best broken bones, shattered skulls, and smashed femurs of this week's football. I'm Odalina, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Arnbert, and we're here to talk to you about pure medieval football.
That's right, we'll have all the latest from all the big games of this weekend, like Ampleforth v Sproxton, Packington v Little Packington, and Rossi Ockle v Glenfarg.
That's right, it was a really exciting week for football. We saw a lot of really good action, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of violence. There were tears, there were deaths, there were funerals, there were baptisms, there were christenings. So let's dive right in with that incredible, explosive match between Ampleforth and Sproxton. And I'm not talking about explosive in the figurative sense because a cow did explode sometime around the 95th minute.
That's right, it's a good reminder for all of us, never keep your cows or your Greek fire round your football pitch. It can only cause problems. I mean, this was a pretty lopsided outcome for Sproxton here, but it really all hinges on that one very controversial decision. I mean, that tackle on John of Loxley.
I quite agree. It was a very controversial decision that he made to dive from the rafters of the barn. We're going to play the footage right here now for you to see. You can see John is hanging out in the rafters of the barn. He's got an absolutely massive scythe in his hands. And look at this right here. We're going to see out of the corner, Richard of Littleworth is going to come in through the barn and John is going to dive right onto him. He's going to smash his skull with the butt of the scythe. And it's all over at that point, isn't it?
What can you say? It really was a game of two halves. In the sense that he did cut Roger's body in half with that giant scythe.
And again, as we said, controversial because it did land him in prison where he is currently awaiting sentencing and most likely execution. But he did win the game for Ampleforth, and I think that's absolutely so crucial because we're at that point in the season where Michaelmas is coming up, and it's really results like these that matter. Now, moving on to Packington versus Little Packington. Of course, Packington were the favourites going into this.
On account of Little Packington being so malnourished.
Exactly. So, as you can see, we'll play some footage from the kickoff, and indeed, someone did have his limbs kicked off. It was a controversial offside, wasn't it? Because those limbs were just ripped right off of his sides. Not something you see too often in a match like this, but it did allow Godbert Northwich to grab that pigskin away and make for the other side of the field.
Now we got to turn our attention northwards, north of the border, to my home country of Scotland, and the big news from the Fife Derby. Rossi Ockle faced Glenfarg.
Yeah, let's look at the scores here for this match. Quite interesting. We'll see Rossi Ockle had 6 fractured patellas, 12 broken clavicles, 1 brain hemorrhage, 6 cases of the plague, and of course, at the end, 1 decapitation. So that was pretty impressive for Glenfarg to rack up, and you can see they really are just an impressive team, aren't they?
Aye, but that injury statistic is really going to hurt them later in the season. Now, of course, it was a very emotional day because there was a very important celebrity guest in the audience. We had King James himself watching from the sidelines, known to be a great fan of the game and a big supporter of Rossi Ockle.
And we've actually got King James in the studio with us today for an interview. Welcome, Your Highness.
Alright, what's happening?
So you've been a fan of Rossi Ockle for quite some time, haven't you, Your Highness?
Aye, but they've been pushed for years. The nonsense I've had to put up with as a Rossi Ockle fan for the last 10 years has been abysmal. I mean, before today, everyone was saying the manager's got to go because the truth is he's lost the dressing room, especially after the dressing room got washed away in that flood.
But we did see some absolutely incredible play from Rossi Ockle. I mean, Glenfarg some would say on parchment, had the better side, but at the end of the day, Rossi Arkell really swept in for the victory, and I think, wouldn't you agree that we've seen some real improvement from players like Angus Gordon Murtock McMillan-Tyre?
We've got AGB, Super AGB.
So, thank you so much for joining us in the studio today, Your Highness. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Are there any closing remarks you'd like to make on today's outcome?
Well, I'm afraid I won't be leaving on account of the fact that this entire operation will be shutting down immediately on account of the fact that football is illegal in Scotland and also England and maybe Italy. I do can.
Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Okay,
you're all going
to
to the castle.
We're moving out, okay.
You're coming with me. Let's go. Take him in, boys. Take him in. This has been Football Break. And now, a word from my sponsors.
The feast is o'er. Now brimming wine in lordly cappuccino shine before each eager guest. And silence fills the crowded hall, as deep as when the herald's call thrills in the loyal breast. Let heaven all of it hear and hereafter.
Welcome back to the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. We are kicking off a very special episode today. As you may have gleaned already, we are going to be talking about football.
That's right, because as this, possibly this moment that this episode comes out will be the kickoff of the first match of Euro 2024, the most exciting sporting event of the year in the sense that Scotland is in it. Unfortunately,
Aaron has neglected to give me any kind of visual indication as to which football team he supports.
I am wearing a Scotland strip. I also have a big Scotland flag that I couldn't find.
Oh, God.
By the way, if you're watching this after the game and you're thinking about looking up the score and maybe checking if Scotland did indeed beat Germany, don't worry about it. It's fine. Don't look at it.
It's all good. That's right. So we're going to be charting the history of football from its origins in the early Middle Ages and the origins of medieval sports in general. And we're going to be discussing the relationships that medieval people from across the socioeconomic scale, so to speak, had with sports, and in particular with football, because as we've already alluded to, football was not an uncontroversial sport in the Middle Ages.
Well, it was illegal.
It was...
for large parts of the Middle Ages.
In England, indeed, it was illegal, I would say, after a certain point, more often than not. In fact, by the mid-17th century, football had been banned by law over 30 times in England, and that's not even counting the laws in Scotland that were passed against it. So in this episode, we're going to be trying to answer this question of why was football banned so many times? I mean, most things that are banned get banned once, like murder. Despite the fact that people still murder each other, we usually don't pass the same law over and over again. So in order to answer this question, we're going to be talking about, first off, a little bit of medieval sports context in general, not just restricted to football. We'll be talking a bit as well about the evolution of football and what it looked like in the Middle Ages, how similar it was to modern football, which, spoiler alert, not very. So we'll be comparing some medieval and modern football a little bit to see what the similarities and differences were, and talking a little bit as well about sports violence in particular, trying to look at, can we get a good idea of how violent medieval sports were in comparison to modern sports, and how helpful are medieval contemporary accounts of sports violence going to be in helping us answer that question. And hopefully by the end we will have given you a little bit of insight into why this was something that was so frequently the target of legal prohibition. So, with that being said, let's dive right in.
So I think the first place to start, before we get into the sort of into the place of medieval sport in society, is to talk about the bands themselves, because they're quite instructive. So the first explicit reference that we have to football in England comes from it being banned in 1314 with the proclamation of Nicholas Farringdon, Lord Mayor of London, who has a proclamation that reads, "Whereas our Lord the King is going towards the parts of Scotland in his war against his enemies, and has especially commanded us to strictly keep his peace, and whereas there is a great uproar in the city," that means London, "towards certain tumults arising from the striking of great footballs in the fields of the public, from which many evils perchance may arise, which may God forbid we do command and do forbid on the king's behalf, upon pain of imprisonment, that such a game shall not be practised henceforth within the city." So at that stage, that's just London. And if you're in, like, Yorkshire, you're fine.
Thank God.
So your Blades v. Owls game can go ahead.
But not for long, right?
No, because in 1365 there's a further proclamation under the rule of Edward III, which reads, "Every able-bodied man on the said city on feast days when he has leisure shall in his sport use bows and arrows or pellets and bolts, forbidding them under pain of imprisonment to meddle in the hurling of stones, handball, football, or other vain games of no value, as the people of the realm, noble and simple, used henceforth to practice the said art in their sports, whence by God's help came forth honour to the kingdom and advantage to the king in his actions of war. And now the said art is now almost wholly disused, and the people indulge in the games aforesaid, and in other dishonest and unthrifty or idle games, whereby the realm is like to be without archers."
So this is a pretty interesting development, because
Yes.
not only do we have a ban on football, but we also have an ostensible justification given for this. That's not just, oh, it's a massive nuisance. Edward III is saying, we're banning football in particular so that you guys can practice your archery and make more archers for our realm.
But why would Edward III want everybody in England to become really good archers,
Well, we'll
Olivia?
circle back to that. Because it wasn't just in England where it was banned, as King James informed us in our beautiful intro.
So football was repeatedly banned by successive Scottish kings, along with the golf, because just because we invented it doesn't mean we can't ban it. But that didn't stop at least one Scottish king from participating in the football, because we have a record from the accounts of the Lord High Treasurer of Scotland during the reign of James IV, that has an item that reads, "Item, the 12th day of April, given to James Dog to buy footballs to the king. 2 shillings.
Yeah, this is pretty funny, and I was reading about this as well, and actually reading about this led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. This is a bit of an aside, so sorry about this, but reading about this, and you know where I'm going with this, led me down a rabbit hole about James Dog, who was, I believe, at the time the Queen's Keeper of the Wardrobe, which doesn't necessarily seem like a prestigious title, but actually it wasn't just clothing, it was a position where you were in charge of essentially keeping track of and allocating most of the resources in the household, although that did include clothing.
And footballs.
And footballs. And this led me to read about a dispute that was chronicled by William Dunbar, the court poet of James IV, who apparently had beef with James Dog. This is a bit convoluted, so I'm sorry, but it's so good that I have to explain it. Apparently he had beef with James Dog because the Queen gave him a doublet and said, here's some written proof of this gift of a doublet. You just need to go to the wardrobe and get this doublet from James Dog. And according to William Dunbar, James Dog was, like, a bit rude to him in the process. We don't hear from William Dunbar that James Dog wouldn't give him the doublet or that any kind of altercation took place, but just apparently that William Dunbar didn't like James Dog's tone of voice, which then led William Dunbar to write a poem addressed, ostensibly to the Queen about James Dog that uses the refrain, "Madam, ye have a dangerous dog," and is just kind of generally replete with dog puns. So the poem itself was written originally in medieval Scots. I've updated a few of the stanzas into modern English, and when I say into modern English, I don't mean to say that Scots is an archaic form of English, but rather that, the poem was
Well,
written...
Middle Scots is an archaic form of Scots, and you don't speak Scots, and neither do most of our listeners.
Exactly. Anyways, here's a poem that William Dunbar wrote about James Dog. This is an excerpt therefrom. When that I showed to him your... Actually, would you like to do this in your best Scottish accent?
Oh, I could. I suppose I could.
Here is a historic reconstruction of what William Dunbar might have sounded like reading this poem.
When that I showed to him your marks, he turned to me again and barks, as he were worrying a hog. Madam, ye have a dangerous dog. When that I showed to him your writing, he snarls that I can have a biting. How would he have a heavy flog? Madam, ye have a dangerous dog. When that I speak to him, friend-like, he barks like he's a middling tyke that's chasing cattle through a bog. Madam, you have a dangerous dog.
Yep. It's good stuff, but the story doesn't end there.
Yes, because there's a sequel.
Later on...
A much more passive-aggressive sequel.
William Dunbar writes another poem in which ostensibly he's writing to the Queen apologizing for his earlier treatment of James Dog, but in fact is just using this as an opportunity to get in a few more digs. And I think that this is already suggested by the title, which is, he is not dog, he is a lamb. So he's saying, he's not a dangerous dog, he's a lamb. And once again, I have a slightly updated version of a couple of the stanzas. Aaron, take it away.
The wife that waits at home for him, who'd love a chance to break his shins. I would she'd drowned in a dam. He is not a dog, he is a lamb. The wife who'd love to cuckold him. I wish she would have every limb get battered by a barrow tram. He is nae dog, he is a lamb.
So he's written a first poem saying, oh, this guy's a bastard. And then he's written a second poem saying, you know what? James Dog isn't so bad. In fact, you know that wife who hates him and would love to cheat on him. I wouldn't mind if she died violently. They should kill her. So yeah, it's a pretty beautiful saga.
I have to say, I think that the James Dog saga, it really is like, it speaks to a deeper divide in Scottish society, and particularly a deeper divide in Edinburgh society. Like, what's his name? William Dunbar is very much he's a very classic Edinburgh type that people know about, but like he's also. But there is a second type of Edinburgh guy,
yes,
which is the guys that I grew up with, and very much are the James Dogs of this world. And I have to say, when I picture James Dog being like, I've got to get some footballs for the king, I do like to think of him as a bit of a bad influence.
Yeah.
Being like, all right, Jimmy, how's this for a weekend, right? I've just been doing the Gorgie Tesco. I've picked up a couple of 2-litre bottles of Frosty Jacks. How's about we neck them, sneak round the back of Tynecastle, and launch chicken nuggets at Lawrence Shankland's dome?
It's not a guy that I've grown up with, but every time I've taken a taxi in the Edinburgh area, that's who's been behind the wheel.
And you know the thing is, they're all sound as fuck.
Yeah, they are. You can fucking count on them.
I would die for every James Dog. They've never let me down, ever.
Like, James Dog shops at Lidl. William Dunbar shops at the Morning Cycle. That's all I can say. I think that part of why we're discussing football on this episode of the podcast, well, okay, a big part of it is because the Euros are starting in 5 days' time, and
Scotland!
We're getting pumped. Exactly.
Scotland!
But also because I think sports are a really fascinating and in some ways unique instance of something that can be observed at all levels of society, and is also something that occupies a place of cultural importance in societies around the world, even before the Middle Ages. most societies had some kind of sporting culture.
Yeah, I mean, the Aztecs played like an evil version of basketball.
Yeah, exactly. Native Americans in what's now the US played lacrosse, which was also incredibly violent. Ancient Romans played violent sports games. And so sports, and in particular violent sports, are definitely something that was an underpinning of society for quite some time. And medieval society is no exception to this. Although I would say that when most people think of the Middle Ages and sports, they don't think of a bunch of guys kicking a football around. Probably the most characteristically medieval sport is the tournament, or tourney.
Especially if they've been to medieval times.
Yes, exactly.
They don't have football at medieval times, as far as I know.
But imagine if they did. I would go. So, when you think of a medieval tournament, you probably think of two guys on horses wearing armor with, fancy ribbons and flags and stuff, and they're running at each other with their jousting lances, trying to knock each other off their horses. But the original form of the tournament in the Middle Ages, which actually originated on the continent, in France in particular, and was brought to England around the 12th century, in this tournament format, jousting might have happened as like a lead up, as a sort of opening act, but the big event was the melee. And this was essentially a big staged battle that would take place on a massive open field. Sometimes it would be between two sides, sometimes it would be a massive free-for-all, and knights would come from all over the place to take part in this. And sometimes it was so prohibitively expensive because you would need so much equipment, you would need to travel, you'd need a place to stay while you're there, so you might even have to have someone, a rich guy, sponsor you. But you would go out.
It's like going to FurryCon.
Yes, a little bit. In some ways, yes. There were various aims of the melee, so in some cases, when there were two sides, one side would try to break the other's ranks and then complete some kind of maneuver, or maybe you were just battering each other, trying to knock as many people down as you can. And so these early tournaments could often be deadly, and it was something that people accepted going into these tournaments, that they might not come out alive. But it was preferable, actually, if you're taking part, not to kill the people on the other side.
Funny
because you, not out of the good of your heart, because you're just a soft soul that abhors violence, but actually what you were trying to do when you're out on the field was incapacitate people so that you could then ransom them back for money.
Yes!
So you could actually, and I should say I tried to look into what would happen if no one wanted to buy you back. If no one was going to pay your ransom, but I guess maybe this was one of the places where the sponsors came in. And this could actually be a massive source of prestige and also, of course, money, because you would be ransoming the knights, you'd be ransoming their horses, probably their equipment as well. But also, this could be a great opportunity for you as a knight to gain some prestige, because you've been skillful enough to not only incapacitate this guy, but leave him alive. And if he's an older knight, if he's more experienced than you, then everyone is going to be saying, wow, I love this guy. I'm going to be his next sponsor at the next tournament. And this could actually, in some cases, be a source of social mobility for participants in these tourneys. Although, of course, you would have to be a knight and a person of some means in the first place in order to participate. But there are some amazing examples of people who were able to improve their social standing just by being really, really good at this tournament format. So one guy who I was reading about, who was an example of this, was William Marshall, who was an Anglo-Norman soldier in England in the 12th century. He was the son of a minor nobleman. He didn't inherit any land or any wealth to speak of. However, he was knighted while fighting around the age of 20, and he soon started turning an absolutely amazing profit, ransoming captives from tournaments. And he became so well known for this, and was so well respected for his martial prowess, that actually King Henry II of England appointed him guardian and tutor to the Crown Prince of England at the time. So this was an absolutely massive step up, because now he's in with the king. And this is another tangent, so I'm sorry. We're getting off to a tangential start. But I was reading about this man, William Marshall, who has been assigned the epithet in some cases of the greatest knight. And he had an amazing life. I mean, to me, he's like medieval Wolf of Wall Street. And I'm going to tell you why. I mean, he had a fascinating early life. Already at a young age, William's father took part in a rebellion against the King of England. There's a long backstory there that I won't get too into, but he eventually was laying siege to the king's castle, and before they entered into negotiations, the young William, who was about 5 years old, was given over to the king as a hostage. At which point the king, apparently, when negotiations broke down, threatened to have William hanged, to which William's father said, "Go ahead," and apparently in this letter wrote, "I still have the hammer and the anvil with which to forge more and better sons." Which is absolutely brutal.
It's a great example of my button is bigger and more powerful than his, and mine works.
Yes.
But also, I do love that his message is, go ahead, kill my shitty kid.
Well, and then, this I think is a slightly more spurious anecdote, but it is said that then, at that point, the king put young William, who, remember, is a 5-year-old child, on the walls of the castle in a trebuchet and said, "I'm gonna catapult your son off these castle walls if you don't stand down." Which, I mean, William's father already seemed like he made his opinion clear, and indeed he did not change his stance. I mean, William was, I think, his 4th son. So, to be honest, bad hostage-taking procedures on the part of the king, but apparently the king couldn't bring himself to catapult a young child off castle walls in a trebuchet. So William was spared, lived to become a knight. Later, as a knight, he was sent to do something in France and got captured by French people. Already a big yikes. He was wounded in the encounter and thrown into a dungeon, and apparently was on the verge of dying of his wounds, but someone, and it's not known who, snuck a bunch of bandages inside of a loaf of bread that was meant to feed him, which is absolutely amazing. We'll never know who that was.
I mean, that does seem like the most efficient way to get a yeast infection ever devised, but...
Nice. He also fought hand-to-hand in combat against Richard the Lionheart before Richard was king and before he was the Lionheart, and apparently succeeded in knocking Richard off of his horse, so that would make him the only man ever to do so. And he had the opportunity to kill Richard, but instead decided to spare him, killed Richard's horse. This was a smart move. I think he was playing the long con, William Marshall, because Richard soon assumed the throne of England and was like, "Oh my god, William Marshall, you're such a good knight. Do you want to be my knight?" So, pretty good stuff. He also was famously money hungry, despite the fact that he, compared to most of the nobles he was interacting with, basically came from dirt. He declined lots of offers of marriage from wealthy and noble women because apparently they weren't wealthy or noble enough for him.
God, he's so cool.
And, around the age of 40, I will say this isn't great. He married a 17-year-old.
Oh.
But...
I'm slightly less invested in him now.
Well, so this obviously isn't great. I think we do have to remember different standards, different times. He married the object of his heart's desire, who was this 17-year-old Irish noble lady named Isabel. Not a great age difference, but I don't think it's, like, our job to discourse on medieval age differences.
He was super cancelled on medieval Twitter.
Exactly. But according to all sources, he was insanely whipped and never took a mistress, despite the fact that they ended up having to spend some time apart, which is pretty significant because it was really common to take a mistress and people weren't really secretive about this. He also famously once told his men, because this woman was of much higher social standing than her, he said, "As we well know, I have no claim to anything here, save through her." They were married for 30 years until he died, after which point she apparently died as well, of a broken heart. They traveled all over the place together. They had 10 kids who all survived to adulthood, which is amazing. And while she was on her own in her homeland in Ireland, while pregnant at age 35, Isabel led a successful military campaign to put down a rebellion in her province. So, I mean, again, yeah, I'm not gonna, like, say that I give this 800-year-old union my moral blessing, but I think it paints a pretty striking picture.
I think she's a bad bitch.
I think she was a baddie. Anyways, my point being, sports were pretty important to people in the Middle Ages because they could... because they could offer a lot.
Like baddies.
They could get you to, you know, wealth, baddies, notoriety. So they were a pretty important way in general, I would say, not just to make money, but for medieval nobles to demonstrate and consolidate their power and their prowess. And this was true, I would say, even as melees fell out of fashion in the high to late Middle Ages and jousting became more of the focus of the tournament. And
which, can I just say, is a crying shame, because I think that a melee sounds like the best fun imaginable, as long as you don't get murdered.
it does sound like a grand old time.
Like, if you were doing it with, like, oh god, now I'm about to reinvent LARPing, but if you just did that with, like, I don't know, like, blunt swords and just sort of whacked at each other for a day and ran around and yelled. Oh, that's just spiritually speaks to me.
No, absolutely. And especially because as jousting became more the main part of the tournament, this also coincided with technologies in armor making improving, and so basically by the end of the Middle Ages, when tournaments started to fall out of fashion in general, it was just guys with wooden lances breaking their wooden lances on each other's plate armor. I don't think it would have been particularly interesting to watch.
Nah, it seems a bit dull. Give me, like, 100 guys just smashing each other over the head with big sticks and kidnapping one another.
Absolutely. But that's a bit of background on sports that were more practiced by the nobility, of which there were, of course, many more, not just tournaments. But I think that gives us an interesting baseline for comparison with football.
Yeah, because one of the things you will have noticed is that we've not talked all these sports that get practiced in sort of at tournaments. Football's not one of them.
Nope.
This is not a sport of the elite. At least in, like, northeastern Europe, so, like, England, Scotland, Ireland, France. It's not played by the elite.
No. Absolutely not. And so, unfortunately, our sources on football are, in some cases, a lot more sparse. Mm-hmm. And often, our sources from football only come from places where it entangled with the law and ran afoul of the nobility and the enforcers of the law. And so, we don't have quite as many rich sources, written and visual, for football. That being said, I think now it is time to get into, perhaps, a little bit of what it meant to play football in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, so essentially what it meant to play football in the Middle Ages is you get the 500 biggest men from your town, and then you go to another person's town, and the 500 biggest men from their town run around and then try and get a ball from one end of the town to the other and break everything.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading a source that said that football could be understood not necessarily entirely as a sport, but rather as part of a culture of ritualized violence, of
yes.
which there was sometimes a ball involved. Because, yeah, it wasn't really like, oh, do you want to play, for instance, you know, football or baseball today? It was more like, do you want to beat the shit out of each other with a football or without a football?
So here is a list of things that are essential to modern football that you do not see in medieval football. Limited teams of players, a pitch, referees, the offside rule. Because modern football, as we understand it, association football, what the Americans and the Australians call soccer, is a product of the 19th century. It was essentially the first rules for football were written down by a bunch of Cambridge academics in the 1860s, and then a few years later, England established the first football association, which for the first time created a system of rules by which the game was played. And these were relatively strict rules. There would be a pitch. There would be, for the most part, no contact between the players. And you could score as many goals as you want before the end of the game. Now, one thing that is essential to the game of football that doesn't appear in the early 19th century is the concept of passing. Essentially, what you would do back in the day is you would just the early sort of 19th, early 20th century football players would just sort of take the ball and just kind of run as far as they could with it until somebody intercepted them. Whereas a Glasgow-based team called Queen's Park, who are still around, by the way, created this innovative new system called teamwork. And passing the ball around, which is now the entire basis of how the modern game of football is played, right? It's all about the control of space and angles and movement, rather than run very fast in a straight line.
Yeah, and part of the reason why these formalized rules were introduced in the 19th century was to allow different teams from different places to play each other. Because this wasn't a thing, you didn't actually have teams in the Middle Ages like, oh, Norwich is going to go to Aston Villa and they're going to play each other. You do have regular matches that occur between two different sides that we could describe as teams, but often these are they're kind of playing with what I think you could describe as house rules. You know, each of these matchups, each of these fixtures involves a kind of specific set of rules that's specific to, you know, this group of people and this recurring, you know, football match. So it's hard to describe medieval football in broad strokes, but I think there are some things that we see over and over again in medieval football. So to get a little bit into some of the details, so one thing that we know is that ball games in general were often played on special occasions, so the most common of these being Shrovetide, so right before Lent. But we also have records of football matches being played on baptisms and other special occasions, so, you know, your baby's getting baptized, let's all go break each other's skulls open in the fields. And we know that all sorts of people played, so villagers, people who you would think of as peasants, and townspeople. London was apparently a sporting center of the Middle Ages in England as now. Students, even clergymen.
Well, they had to pass a law that stopped people from playing football in churchyards.
Yes, exactly.
The clergy were getting sick of it.
Yeah, in particular, it was, I think, a law that fined clergymen who let people play football in their churchyards. And one notable absence from the records of people who we know played football is women. So we don't actually have any records that I'm aware of from the Middle Ages of women playing football.
No, the earliest account of women's football comes from actually the 18th century, and it's very much in a tone of roll up, and see the remarkable feat of women playing the footed ball. Like it's a novelty.
Exactly. So what did these matches look like? Well, you had two sides, and often these weren't necessarily arbitrarily chosen sides. So often this would be, for instance, two neighboring villages. You know, you get all the men from both villages and they all play against each other. It could be two rival university colleges. You had instances of all of the bachelors playing all of the married men in a town, which is great.
The incels versus the chads.
Yeah. And you have lots of examples of so-called town and gown matches, so students playing townspeople in the town where they're studying.
Which, if you've listened to our universities episode, I would imagine would be some of the most hotly contested and violent.
Yes.
People have got a lot of resentments about university students they need to work out.
Absolutely. And there weren't generally, in England and Scotland, limits on the numbers of people that played on each side, so this could be anywhere from a handful to a couple hundred or more. So what does match day actually look like for medieval football? So you have a ball that's usually made out of a pig's bladder covered in leather is the most common thing. It might be fabric as well. It might be stuffed. It might not be stuffed. And you can imagine this producing different effects.
Again, this is in a world before the Football Association.
Exactly.
So there is no standardization.
Yeah, there's no fixed size.
If you want to Tom Brady it and deflate your opponent's football,
Yep, exactly.
it's fine.
And generally, these matches were played in a fixed sort of playing field. So this wasn't a football pitch as we would know it today. In fact, it might often be quite a bit bigger. So there are instances of neighboring parishes playing against each other, and the entire football playing fields being from one parish's church to the others. But in general, the setup was this. You have your ball, you have your teams, or maybe it's a free-for-all. Either way. And basically, someone throws the ball in, and then after that, if it's teams, then you probably are trying to get the ball to the far end of your opponent's side. If it's a free-for-all, maybe you're playing for a fixed amount of time, and the person who's holding the ball at the end is the winner. So these also aren't games necessarily with a fixed time frame. Usually, in the case of team games, they would go on until someone scores a goal, which, again, if you're playing over a field that's a couple miles long, you can imagine would be quite a production. And in terms of rules, I think in a lot of cases, there probably weren't many. So even things like, how are you touching the ball? Is it with your feet? Is it with your hands? Usually, it doesn't seem like there's a restriction being put on this. So you can be picking the ball up and running with it, for instance, but people on the other team are also completely at liberty to tackle you and beat you up, and, as we've said, break your bones. So basically, the only things that aren't allowed are things that would break the law.
Like stabbing people.
Exactly.
Which still happened.
Yes, exactly. So you shouldn't murder anyone, and you probably shouldn't...
You get a yellow card for that.
Exactly.
They'll get to take a penalty.
You get a red card for murder, a yellow card for broken bones. So these could easily be pretty violent matches.
So to get a sense of like what the vibe of one of those games actually is, I think you have to go to one of the few places that still plays a version of this game, which is the town of Ashbourne in England, which still has an annual Shrovetide football game that follows the sort of the traditional medieval rules. And what they do is basically they have a game once a year on Shrovetide, which involves pretty much the entire town, with goals at the northeastern and southwestern ends of the town, and the entire town becomes the football pitch. And there's one account from a documentary I watched about this. One time in 1960, the ball went through the window of a Woolworths. You know Woolworths, right?
Yeah, we've still got them in Germany.
Yes, that was... Okay, tangent time. The first time I went to Germany, I remember stopping dead in my tracks in shock at the sight of a German Woolworths, because they'd been closed in the UK for like a decade at that point.
Yeah, Woolworth is fucking great.
It's really good. They need to bring back Woolworths.
Woolworth is like Flying Tiger for hard men.
It is, though.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of my first ever Instagrams later, because I was like, check out this shit they got over here. They still got Woolworths. But anyway, so the ball goes through the Woolworths, and so they just play the game through the Woolworths and out the other side of the Woolworths through the shop exit, and people are just pilfering handfuls of sweets as they're going, and that almost got the game banned. The reason why it doesn't get banned is because Woolworths just never complained.
Wow.
They just went with it. Anyway, like, fences get kicked down, walls get kicked down, people get the shit kicked out of them constantly.
Yeah.
Like, the rivalry between the upwards and the downwards, who are the two teams in the town, is, like, legendary. It seems like a massive clusterfuck, but also a fun day out.
And as I mentioned before, London in the Middle Ages is a football hotspot, and they're also playing this in the streets. I mean, a lot of records of complaints we have about medieval football It's being played in the city streets, so you can imagine this happening. Like, oh, they've smashed into the butcher's shop, they've smashed into the blacksmith's. Like, you can imagine these just being utterly destructive, because they're, absolutely brutal, absolutely bitter rivalries. And you can imagine, like these two halves of the town, there being these long-standing rivalries.
I don't need... Imagine if a city was divided into a long-standing rivalry between two football teams. I cannot comprehend that.
Exactly.
That only describes every single city in the UK with a population over 100,000 people.
Yep.
Fun fact about football being played through city streets. We have a great complaint about football being played through a town, which is graffiti in the old city of Dubrovnik, which was at the time was in the Middle Ages was the Italian colony of Ragusa. We have graffiti that reads, "Remember you will die, who are now playing ball." And then pax vobis memento mori qui videntis So we've been lying to you, as we like to do on a regular basis, up to this point by pretending that there is only one kind of football being played in medieval Europe. But the truth is that there ain't. There is an entirely separate and, in many ways, much better documented version of football being played at this very moment in Italy, in Florence, in Firenze.
God, the Italians are going to be so smug about this.
Yeah.
Mamma mia, we invented a football.
Well, really they invented rugby, right? And if there's one thing I've learned from the Six Nations, it's that if Italy's invented rugby, they should be fucking better at it.
Yeah, this is fair. This is fair. I should say, though, that, the distinction of, like, football being specifically something that you can only play with your feet and not your hands. I mean, that's not even something that exists today, because even rugby, the full name is rugby football. You've got Australian rules football.
Aussie fucking football.
You're maybe allowed to use your hands?
As long as the fucking ref's not looking.
Exactly. So I think, when we say football, I've said this before, like, we're talking about ball games in general.
Or American football. And as we know with American football, there's a little kicking.
A little bit. Anyways, but what are they up to in Italy?
So in Italy, they're playing a game called calcio, which is also the name of modern football in Italy, confusingly. But we're just going to use calcio to refer to the game that's played in Florence in the Renaissance period. So our oldest extant source for Florentine calcio comes from a text by Giovanni di Bardi in 1580. And if the name Di Bardi sounds familiar, it's because the Bardis were a very successful and influential and important family in Florence. Do you want to guess what they did for a living?
Banking.
They were bankers.
Oh, classic.
Yes. And Bardi basically writes a book on calcio, because he sits down and says, well, nobody has really written a book about our beloved game up till now that we've played for centuries, so I'm going to do it. It's terrible. I'm sorry to the Italian people. Not sorry for the thing I said earlier about your rugby team, but...
well, that's just
true.
That's just saying it like it is. They're not good at rugby. Anyways. Let me crack open another drink. Bang it!
So, as I sort of alluded to, the game that Bardi describes is much closer to rugby than association football. You have the same rules about tackling, scrummage, and passing systems that are common to both. In addition to the sort of its rugby-like features, it's important to note that calcio is played in a specific location, which would usually just be like a piazza. And it is there are a certain number of players on each side, so it's a much more regulated sport. It's much more, in many ways, recognizably modern, And they say that, oh, this is what they played in the Roman times, and we've been passing it down for centuries. What you should know by now will almost certainly be total horseshit. But
Yep.
and everything that claims to be old is actually new. Just bear that in mind.
Yep.
Anyway, so Bardi, when he's writing about Calcio, one of the interesting things is the position that Calcio has in Florentine society. Because it's not prohibited, and it's not the sport of the working class. It is, in fact, a sport that's played by the aristocracy. So we know, for example, that Lorenzo de' Medici, those are one of the most influential leaders of the Medici family, who are the, fantastically wealthy bankers who took over, basically, the Florentine Republic in the late Middle Ages. Lorenzo de' Medici was an avid football player. Loved it. And in fact, in Bardi's text, he talks about it as this moral good. And this is something that I think is incredibly interesting, to compare and contrast the way that football is written about in Italy versus in England. So in Italy, Bardi compares Calcio actually to Roman battle formations. So, for example, the forwards have to attack in the same way as slingers did in Roman times. And and halfbacks, their role is like elephants. And that link of Romanness is explicitly political, because remember, it's very important to remember that the Florentine Republic was established in the late Middle Ages and made it to like the 16th century was meant to be a revival or continuation of the Roman Republic from yonks ago. And to Bardi and to a lot of other Florentine writers, Calcio is a representation of the Roman essence of the city. So he writes to the leader of the city and says that, since this city of yours follows the same paths which the Romans went, it has not failed in the present day to occupy its youth in the most noble exercises, season by season. Now, think about that. So you got the noble exercises, and then compare and contrast to how an English chronicler talks about football in England. A game, I say, abominable enough, and in my judgment at least, more common, undignified, and worthless than any other kind of game, rarely ending but with some loss, accident, or disadvantage to the players themselves. It's quite different, isn't it?
Well, just the fact that someone has written a book about it in the
Yes.
first place in Italy, I think, already hints at a pretty significant difference. So yeah, it's pretty clear, I think, that football occupies a pretty specific role in the British Isles in the Middle Ages, and a lot of this has to do with how it's perceived by people, with its reputation. So it's pretty clear that sports in the Middle Ages, and in particular football, have a pretty big reputation in England for being incredibly violent. And of course, it's not just football that's violent. I mean, we have instances of a lot of different sports giving rise to violent exchanges. I was actually reading a record from London from 1276 in which a chess match turned violent and ended with someone named David de Bristol stabbing a woman named Juliana because apparently she was beating him at chess. And in general, as I alluded to before, it seems like brawls and wrestling matches were incredibly important forms of sports at all levels of medieval society, and indeed among the lower classes. And of course, it's easy to imagine how these would give rise to a less controlled form of violence. I was reading another example from 13th century London of a group of Londoners all going to Bermondsey, which was now is part of London.
Now it's very sort of hoity-toity.
Yeah, which now is kind of hoity-toity central London. Back then was the swampy outskirts, and there was an abbey there, and so this group of Londoners would go to this abbey at Bermondsey for an organized wrestling tournament with the monks. And apparently in one instance this led to such violence that there was a massive fight. One of the Londoners was killed and a bunch of the monks were executed.
Oh my god!
And of course, the violence was not mitigated by the fact that almost everyone in the Middle Ages carried a knife. So in football in particular, I was reading at least 2 separate records of cases where people were playing football. There was one from the 13th and one from the 14th century, and one guy ran into another guy, as would be common even today, but one of them had a knife on his belt, and the knife became kind of jammed between them such that one of them was stabbed and died. 2 different times this happened, and that's just the versions we have records of.
Oh, ref, that's never a pen.
So
That's what they call a soft decision.
yeah, exactly. And not only do we have instances of violence recorded, we have, as we've mentioned before, plenty of instances of people describing football as a particularly violent sport by nature. I was reading about a 15th century morality play simply titled Mankind, in which a character who is the personification or anthropomorphization of mankind as a concept is lured into evil by numerous vices. One of them is a personification of kind of fashion and distraction who is trying to throw him a football and say, "Hey, mankind, come party with us. We've got football."
The personification of football.
Yeah. And I was also reading a 16th century Scots poem about football. It's titled The Beauties of Football. And Aran, if you don't mind.
Bruised muscles and broken bones, strife, discord, and futile blows, lamed in old age, then crippled withal. These are the beauties of football.
Excellent.
There is a slightly less funny sort of depiction of football that I nevertheless found really, really interesting, which is from the Ballad of Sir Hugh of Lincoln. Anyone who knows who Sir Hugh of Lincoln is knows that this is about to go into a really dark place, but if you don't, settle in. So, little St. Hugh of Lincoln was an English boy in the 13th century who died somehow in Lincoln, and his death was attributed to the city's Jewish communities. So, by attributed to Jewish communities, what I mean is that the rumor was that the Jewish people ritually sacrificed him and consumed his blood. This is one of the origins of the thing called blood libel, which is a very, very, very profoundly anti-Semitic trope of Jews either using Christian blood in a ritual fashion or consuming it directly. And at the start of the Ballad of St. Hugh, the inciting incident in many ways is what follows. 24 bonny boys were playing at the ball, and it came by him, sweet Sir Hugh, and he kicked it over them all. He kicked the ball with his right foot, and catched it with his knee, and throuch and throw the Jew's window, he garred the bonny ball flee. Now this is fascinating to me from a literary point of view, because the playing of the football in this narrative is the thing that brings him doom. And it's such a recognizable image. It's so how many kids' stories start with you're playing football and you launch it over the wall of your evil neighbor, and then you have to go and get it back, and it's like, that's scary. Obviously, it's heightened to this kind of absurd degree because of the racist violence that is about to unfold as the result of this. But at the same time, it's presented as innocent because it's just these boys hanging out. So I find that to be a really interesting sort of ambivalence in that text that speaks to a slightly more complex relationship with the sport in folk culture.
Absolutely. I think it's we definitely see footballs arising in pop culture starting in the Middle Ages pretty consistently. I mean, we have examples of people being described as looking like footballs a bit after the Middle Ages, but Shakespeare, I think one of his characters in one of his plays has a line where someone says, "Why do you kick me away like I'm a football?"
Well, there's another Shakespeare play where he says, "You look like a football player."
Exactly. So yeah, it's clear that there's a general perception of what football means morally, but that this might be somewhat perhaps at odds with the role that football actually occupies on a personal level for people, because again, we have examples of King James of Scotland buying footballs. The oldest known football is a football that belonged to Mary Queen of Scots, who was apparently an absolutely massive football fan. And by that, because there weren't really any club teams, I don't mean that she followed one specific team, but she seemed to just love the sport in general.
Plus, to be fair, she was a bit busy with all the shit that happened to her to go to, like, away days.
Yeah, I mean, Henry VIII, who also banned football, apparently was the commissioner of the world's first pair of dedicated football shoes.
Henry VIII, hypocrite. You heard it here first.
Yeah, and I think this raises an interesting question, especially in light of what we've discussed with regards to melees and other forms of ritualized violence. Hunting as well in the Middle Ages was an important form of what I would say is pretty clearly ritualized violence. And so it is interesting, and I think worth discussing further, that there's a clear dichotomy between the ritualized violence of the upper class and of the lower class.
Yes.
Because there's this idea that we see over and over again in the Middle Ages, and, you know, continuing up until the present day, and will certainly continue into the future, that football is a uniquely violent sport, that it's a corrupting influence, that it leads people down the wrong path.
Well, just look at the moral panics in Britain in the 1980s about football hooliganism, and, you know, those kinds of ideas can have really, really dangerous consequences for real-life people. I mean, look at the Hillsborough disaster, which, for anyone who doesn't know, the Hillsborough disaster was a tragedy that took place in the Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield in 1989, where an overcrowded stand of Liverpool fans led to a massive crush that killed 97 Liverpool supporters. And in the aftermath of the disaster, certain news media outlets were very, very quick to blame the tragedy on the fans themselves, the people who died, because they were just like, oh, these are just football hooligans, they're just causing chaos and disorder, as opposed to the people who were actually found to be responsible in the subsequent inquiries, which was the local police force, who made fatal, poor decisions about how many people could be sort of corralled into this tiny space. So these ideas about the inherent corrupting, violent nature of certain sports can kill people and, you know, lead to horrific libel of dead people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's worth looking at why these sports are so persistent and still occupy such roles of cultural importance despite people's attempts to squash them. I was reading some pretty interesting analysis by a 20th century sociologist you may have heard of named Norbert Elias. Unlike most 20th century sociologists, he actually hasn't had his ideas completely dismantled in the subsequent decades, which is why I think he's an interesting place to start from. So he wrote a book called The Civilizing Process, which, when he describes a civilizing process, he's not really, despite the title, creating a dichotomy of civilized versus uncivilized people.
No, it's not a normative statement.
Exactly. What he's discussing is the introduction of things like manners and social norms into societies via the introduction of self-consciousness, such as class consciousness, into societies. And so he actually wrote a bit about sports in particular, and one of his theories on the matter was that these orchestrated ball games, especially those that took place regularly at designated times of the year, could serve as a way of releasing and regulating tension within and between communities. So, of course, ball games were definitely played year-round on a less formal basis, but I think it is significant that these games were being played at particular times of the year as well, and it's usually a time of significance in the Christian calendar. And it doesn't mean that these are, Christian football games. I think a quote from Norbert Elias that I think is very illuminating is that in the Middle Ages, secular, so to speak, life was more religious, and religious life was more secular. There weren't clear boundaries to the same extent as there are today.
Which is why I always glare at you when you use the word secular on this podcast.
That's right. Yeah, so there weren't, to the same extent as today, distinctive boundaries between the church life and the non-church life, so to speak. And so it doesn't mean that people were playing these sports for Christian reasons, but rather that the fact that these sports are taking place at significant times of the year means that they are significant. And in particular, as we see with derbies today, that they could be a good opportunity for people to settle old scores, even if the source of those old scores and rivalries is, the game itself.
Scores like 2-1 and 3-0.
There was a great example that he gave of a clash between students at Cambridge and townspeople in Cambridge. This was the 16th century, but I think we could assume it was part of the same footballing tradition of the previous century. This was an example where students had gone to a football match unarmed, as was, the polite thing to do. The townspeople, on the other hand, clearly having some sort of beef with the students, had hidden inside the church a bunch of sticks and clubs and cudgels. And when they started the football game, ran and grabbed these and started beating the students with them. And apparently the students were kind of, scattered all over the place, screaming. They were unarmed and just being beaten with sticks. And one of the students apparently ran to the town constable and asked him to keep the Queen's peace, at which point the constable, who was playing on the opposing football team, quote the source, who then, being a player at the football with the rest, did turn to the scholars, willing them to keep the Queen's peace. Basically saying, actually, you started it. Another thing that I think is quite fascinating that I read from the same source by Elias is that not every instance of medieval football was complete anarchy. I was reading about a version that was played in Cornwall that, although it was kind of mob style, so to speak, with, masses of players and a pretty violent approach, there were specific rules regarding what was fair. And of course, these were pretty rudimentary rules, but they were also clearly well understood ones by all of the players. So things like don't gang up on people. And, if you tackle someone with the ball, they can surrender the ball and you have to let them up. And that you shouldn't, for instance, kick people in the crotch at all.
Seems fair.
So I think that just, because these people were often largely illiterate and they were following folk customs, there wasn't the need or the ability or the desire to write down these rules and to codify things to the same extent that the upper classes did. But it is still, I think, a bit of a misconception to suggest that football, was just existed as a form of pure violence to satisfy some kind of animal tendency, because clearly there were rules and there was self-regulation. And whereas, for instance, in a tournament, you would have an arbitrator who's the king or the presiding noble person to officiate and to dictate the rules and enforce them. You don't have that in a village of mostly agricultural workers. And so you can imagine then if someone breaks these rules, which form a kind of, mutually agreed upon set of values that govern what's fair, what's sporting, what is moral, then you can imagine how things would spiral into violence pretty quickly.
If he gets to break somebody's knee, I should get to break somebody's knee.
Well, exactly, yeah.
The social contract is broken. I think that what I find super interesting about the moral panics about football, both in terms of the medieval prohibitions on it and the panics in the 80s and 90s about football culture is that there's this clear anxiety about violence, as we've talked about extensively. But another thing that I find super interesting is that certainly in the Middle Ages, the alternatives that are either proposed or mandated by these bans are themselves extremely violent. So if we go back to Edward III's prohibition in 1363, for example, he says, "Every able-bodied man, when he has leisure, shall in his sport use bows and arrows or pellets or bolts, whence by God's help came forth honor to the kingdom and advantage to the king in his actions of war." So this is not less violent than football, but it is structured, ordered violence being directed in the interests of the state. And that, I think, is the core of why football is so intimidating to a lot of medieval rulers, is because it is not it's not productive violence. It's diffuse. And that speaks to a wider point, I think, which is that one of the things you see in medieval Christian culture is there's not a lot of emphasis placed on leisure activities for their own sake. There's not this idea that leisure activities should be useful in a direct sense. Like, if you're doing something that's not good for you or your family or God or the king, then you're wasting your time. Interestingly, this is not an attitude that is shared by the Florentines when they're talking about Calcio, even though Calcio is no less violent. And by the way, it's still played in Florence to this day, and I've seen some videos of it, and it's basically just a bunch of sweaty, incredibly buff, shirtless Italian men breaking each other's noses for half an hour.
How are they so bad at rugby?
I don't know. I don't think most of Italy knows about rugby, to be fair.
Fair.
They're too busy screaming Forza Azzurri. Forza Italia. Like, I mentioned earlier that Calcio is played by the elite, and one of the things that comes across really strongly in De Bardi's account of it is that playing this game, it's a self-help activity, because it makes you fitter, it makes you more sort of focused, it makes you more active in very recognizably modern ways that we think about physical activity and self-help and sport and the ideal of the athlete today. And this, I think, reflects a fundamental ideological rupture that is going to spread from Florence and the rest of Italy to the rest of Europe over the early modern period. Florence pioneered the concept of humanism, which is an individualistic ideology that posits that actually individual self-improvement is a positive virtue in its own right because it makes you a better citizen. Therefore, sport, and it doesn't have to be like sport that is actually like useful to you or the state in a direct sense, sport is a fundamental moral good.
Yeah, I was reading a really, really great article by a historian named Thomas S. Henricks, who I think made some really good points. Among them, he suggested that the increasing codification of sports, so for instance, what we see with tournaments shifting from the melee to the jousting format, in some cases, this can be interpreted as a shift of norms away from the individual and towards the collective. So, in other words, by introducing rules and norms to a sport, you're taking the attention away from the individual and the individual's prowess and athletic ability, and you're saying actually what's important is following the rules to align yourself with the group and to impress an external arbitrator. And so I think we can align that with the formalization of tournaments, where all of a sudden they're being kind of coordinated centrally by monarchs. And I think that while this is happening, you can imagine this inability on the part of the authorities to exert control over the sports of the peasantry, like football, to be a cause for concern, especially because the part of the reason why the moral panic about football gets drummed up in the first place is the 100 Years' War.
Yes.
And the introduction of this extended period of war where people are going to be expected to serve their nation as soldiers, or more particularly, serve their monarch as soldiers. And so I think it's not difficult to imagine the panic that the nobles and that the monarchy would feel over this war that's a threat to their livelihoods, that they might be panicking about the fact that, this sense of urgency and this sense of group identity, it's going to be us against them, isn't really trickling down, so to speak, to the peasantry, who aren't really part of this conflict in the first place. And so I think in some cases you can partially interpret these attempts to control sports and to curb football and redirect that energy towards archery and useful, sanctioned, codified forms of violence that are interpreted by the wider society as being useful, as a kind of attempt to instill a sense of duty and obligation towards the monarchy and towards the central authorities of
absolutely.
the regime.
And I don't want to draw too direct a line to this. We are talking about a 400-year stretch of time. But I would say that it is interesting to me in the context of this conversation about useful versus diffuse violence and this idea of the emergence of the ideal of the athlete. It is very interesting to me that hyper-militaristic states in the modern period are so interested in, at the very least, presenting athleticism and a healthy, active society that is willing to go out and commit terrible, terrible acts of violence. I mean, the cult of the athlete is a foundational part of the machismo that is the heart of Italian fascism.
Yes.
That's not me saying that football is fascism. Just to be clear, I'm not being like a scolding woke person. I'm just pointing out that there is a connection between a fetishization of athleticism, a direction of sporting activity towards activities that are useful for war fighting, and the development of an increasingly overbearing state that seeks increasingly greater levels of buy-in from the population.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're going to twist my arm, fine, I'll talk about Trotskyism and the Russian Revolution. Because actually, proletarian culture, and to a lesser extent sports specifically, were a topic of discussion around the time of the Russian Revolution. In particular, a general kind of disdain amongst the Bolsheviks for sports as they were practiced by the proletariat. And there was this massive discussion of, like, what will sports look like after the revolution when we're all egalitarian? And
I still see that discussion happening on my Twitter feed every day.
Yes, exactly.
It has not been satisfactorily resolved.
Yes, and there was, this kind of utopian ideal that was put forth by some scholars and revolutionaries that, well, we won't have competitive sports. We'll have things like carnivals that are just meant for showing off the things that our athletes can do. And as the revolution went on, and as a new Russian state kind of an ideology took shape, it became pretty clear that this wasn't going to cut it, and that sports, actually similar to Italian fascism, as you mentioned, and demonstrating, athletic prowess, it's a really good way for a nation to display its control over its citizens, both internally and externally. And therefore, Russian athletes and Soviet athletes became a massive focus of international attention, because it became a way to send people out into the world and show off, not just what they could do, but what they could do for the state. Just like forcing your medieval peasants to do archery. Instead, we're gonna force Olga to do backflips at the Olympics.
Which I think there's a couple of things that I want to pick up on there. First of all, yeah, the early Russian idealist communists fundamentally misunderstood the fact that competitions are fun. One of the most important parts of sports is having utter contempt for the opposing team. This is something that Scottish people are uniquely good at.
Yes.
See the time that England got knocked out of the Euros in 2016 by Iceland, and immediately the Icelandic national football strip sold out almost entirely due to orders from Scotland. But also the idea of representing your nation, having a duty to your nation, and sporting activities being a representation of your power and importance as a country. I mean, what am I wearing right goddamn now?
Scotland football top.
I am wearing a Scotland football top that has on it
a lion.
a lion. It has the Scottish national crest on it because when the Euros come around, or God knows if we ever qualify for a World Cup ever again, I am going to be talking about we the entire time. Because this is what nationalism does. It allows you to subsume yourself within the wider project of your nation. That's not, by the way, that's not unique to fascism. That's true of basically every single nation state that exists on the face of this earth at the moment. You subsume yourself and become something bigger than yourself, this leviathan, as it were. And so sporting accomplishment becomes incredibly, incredibly important. And to tie this all together with a nice little bow, do you know what one of the foundational events in the development of nationalism on the European continent was?
What's that?
It was, at least in England, Scotland, and France, it was the 100 Years' War.
There you go.
But that is an idea we are going to pick up on in a future episode.
Whoop whoop.
Perhaps 3 future episodes.
To return, since you're going to twist my arm about it, briefly to Trotsky.
Again.
I think it's fascinating that there was this discussion of, like, where will sports culture go? Because Trotsky had this idea that working class people, the proletariat, in other words, hadn't had the opportunity to develop their own culture, and that the revolution would give them an opportunity to finally have some culture of their own. And of course, in this case, he was
Says the
mostly
middle class intellectual.
talking about, visual arts and prestige forms of culture, but I think it's easy to imagine he wasn't even thinking about football. And I think as much as sports can certainly form a harmful part of a nationalist society, I think it's also unfortunate that since the Middle Ages, really up until today, there has been this unbroken chain of people, whether it's aristocrats or intellectuals or whoever else, kind of sneering at sports and at the culture of the working class as being less than. I think it's a real oversight to say, well, the working class didn't have culture, but we can give them the opportunity to do so, because actually, I think these sports and the rituals that go along with them and the cultural significance that they have are an incredibly durable, incredibly, I think, important piece of culture that's existed for thousands of years. And I think it's something we should cherish more.
Yeah, just think about the greens and the blues in the hippodrome.
Yep.
Tearing each other to pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they were the only people who managed to scare Justinian, the Roman emperor, during his great reign. It was the bunch of working class people in the Colosseum chanting Nika. All right, well, this is just about going to do us for this episode of the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. I have been your host, Aaron, and this is my friend Olivia, who I've invited on as a laugh.
Thanks for having me. I hope I didn't embarrass myself. This is my first time out of the house. My father kept me out of society lest I fall victim to predatory men.
Right, okay, Olivia, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at WeirdMedieval, and my personal account is at Olivia__MS.
You can find me at Aaron P. Tappers on Twitter. We also have a Discord, which we frequently forget to mention.
But we have mentioned it, and now we will not only mention it, but link it in the description of this episode. Join the Discord is popping off.
Other things to mention. Olivia has a book. You can buy it. Olivia has merch. You can buy it.
No, I don't. The merch is out of stock.
Oh,
Don't
is it?
fucking buy my merch.
Well,
The number of fucking envelopes I put in the post this month. Don't fucking buy my merch. You can't, but don't.
don't keep this woman in business. She doesn't want it. Olivia, this might come out. Have you considered people might listen to this at a time that is not literally the moment that we're recording it?
I was in Costa Coffee on the weekend in Wanstead.
As you do.
And the guy who was serving me, another guy came in, and when the guy behind the counter started talking more, it became apparent that he was Italian. So this guy walks in, and the Italian guy is like, "Oh, it's good to see you, my darling. You haven't come in recently." And the guy was like, "Oh, how are you doing?" And the Italian guy behind the counter was like, "Oh, good. I haven't been working that many shifts recently. You know me. I love a bit of poverty. It's like a game. How long can I go without eating?" I was like, "God damn, I'm back at uni. This is like my Italian friends at uni pattern."
Morano chat.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways,
well, as we've trailed, and as you could probably tell from the general vibe I'm giving off, next episode, we're going to Scotland.
that stood against them. Proud
Edward's army, and
Wankers.
sent them homewards to think again.
And if you like this podcast,
I forgot about that part.
if you like hearing Aaron and I get jolly over a couple of carbonated beverages of unspecified content.
Before this episode, we agreed that the vibe we wanted to give off is what if we were just at the pub.
Exactly. And you're at the pub with your mates.
Before the game.
Olivia and Aran, and the game's about to start. And if you enjoyed this immersive podcast experience, then we would be tickled pink if you gave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple or your platform of choice. And furthermore, you can even leave us a little comment on Spotify in the "What did you think about this episode" box. And we might even read that comment out loud. Thanks to Bryce, who said, "She holy on my Roman until I empire." Anyways, another banger episode. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Bryce. That means a lot to us. And,
Do Kyle.
thanks as well to Kyle, who said, "Olivia needs to break that French accent out more often." Oh boy.
Well, you have to do it now.
It took me...
It took
This
about
was kind of
20 minutes.
This was alluded to in the episode, but it took me a lot of false starts to get that accent. And one day we will also drop the hurdy-gurdy cut of the Vikings episode in which Joe Mason is failing to maintain a Scandinavian accent and repeatedly needs to revive his accent by saying
Hurdy-gurdy.
Hurdy-gurdy. Welcome to Iceland.
Oh, the stuff that you guys don't hear is so much stupider.
Yeah, we'll drop another outtakes episode soon.
There's going to be a lot of material from this one.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You got to do the French accent. Like, give us the outro in French.
I need to watch a video of Emmanuel Macron.
Watch a video of Lea Seydoux,
No, I need.
and then maybe
Macron.
send it to me.
I need Macron speaking English.
Hello.
Okay, my government is pro-business. It was a very great danger.
Have you seen what's his name? Matteo Renzi speaking English.
The leadership of Sarkozy was not so.
I am always happy to bring out my French accent for you.
Allons-y.
I am a woman wearing a very tall powdered wig with a little model ship stuck inside. Alright, thanks so much for listening, and we will catch you in 2 weeks' time.
In Scotland.
And Scotland, where I
Scotland!
will be in 2 weeks' time, wow.
Oh, I'm sure you will. Yeah. God motherfucking damn.
Alright, okay, I'm ending this.
So Olivia, how much do you think Scotland's going to beat Germany by? 2, 3, or 4?
Half.
Half a goal.
I think it will be a Pyrrhic victory. I think they'll hold the line but lose many men in the process.
Oh, they're gonna send Shay Adams off with missing a foot.
Yes, exactly. A cow will explode.
They're gonna have to give Shay Adams a robot foot.
Yes, like Furiosa.
Maybe then we'll have a fucking striker worth anything.
Yeah.